Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the dialogue series of Mysore School of Architecture. This is a new initiative that we have started. So this is the first in the many more lecture series to come. Today, myself and Professor Balaji will be talking about heritage, focusing mainly on intangible heritage. I would like to begin by introducing myself. I am Professor Shruti Mutalik Desai. I work as an assistant professor at Mysore School of Architecture. My area of interest mostly revolves around understanding the role of cultural practices in conservation. I also strongly believe in incorporating theoretical aspects into design studios. That is something that we have been constantly working towards. And my other area of research interest is understanding practices of various communities, what is the impact that has on heritage and its protection, and understanding the various attributes of traditional knowledge systems. Over to you, Balaji.
Thank you, Shruti. Good morning, everyone. I am Balaji Venkatachari. I work at MSA Mysuru as Associate Professor. I'm qualified as an architect and a conservator. So I have some experience in working on conservation projects before, including one which we have done recently with Golconda Heritage Impact Assessment. And have worked with some projects in Chennai and Thrissur for the government. Today, as Shruti told you, we are interested in exploring intangible attributes of heritage. Specifically, let me quickly take you through the introduction slide. This is the structure in which we are going to speak today. First, Shruti will introduce you to heritage concepts, fundamental concepts, and then we are going to have a short casual conversation on intangible heritage. We'll take a few prominent examples and have a quick conversation. Then I will go on to introduce you to the status of heritage protection in India. We'll show some statistics which will give us a big picture of what is the condition today regarding heritage protection, especially having a focus on intangible heritage. Lastly, we'll close the session by after introducing you to a little initiative which we have undertaken today, which is called Open Curated Cultural Database. This is going to be largely like a public database work. We'll introduce you to that and then we'll close the session. Thank you. Over to you, Shruti.
Yeah. So before dwelling deep into what are the types of heritage, what is tangible heritage and intangible heritage, there are certain basic terminologies that all of us need to be aware of. This is for the benefit of the people who might be new to the concept of heritage. For those of you who are already aware of it, please spare us we are sorry, and you just have to go with this repetition. So first thing is we need to understand two most important things that we need to understand is what is heritage, how is heritage defined, and what is culture.
So the first terminology is heritage. So when we talk about heritage, it is important to understand that it basically encompasses all the processes that have a special meaning in group memory, ideally something which is inherited and passed on from previous generations. So there is no, contrary to the belief that, only if something is 100 years old or 200 years old, it qualifies as heritage. It is not like that. Anything which is important to group memory and anything which has been passed on from previous generations to next generations and has a certain value can qualify as heritage. There is no age bar necessarily as it is usually believed. Another term that we all need to be aware of is culture. We tend to use it quite often in our day-to-day life, but there are certain technical definitions for what culture is. So it is ideally, most popularly defined as what has been shown on your screen. It is a complex that includes knowledge, belief systems, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities acquired by a human as a member of the society. The key point being member of the society. If it is something which only I know and my family knows, it doesn't necessarily qualify as culture. The most important attribute of culture is the fact that I or you should have acquired this knowledge while we are important members of the society. So it is culture is generally attributed to society and people, and when people acquire a particular knowledge system, as a group. So now the next important thing that we need to understand is, how does one identify if something can qualify as heritage or no? So there are basically three things that we need to look at. First is significance. Next is integrity. And the third point is context. I will be taking up each one of these in detail. But we need to understand that for anything to qualify as heritage, it should be significant. There should be a certain integral value that it has. And most importantly, what context is it that this heritage that we're talking about sits in? So whenever we are talking about significance, we are essentially focusing on cultural significance. So it eventually comes down to the property or any particular practice which has history, which has some sort of an association with perhaps architecture or built spaces. It can also be archaeological in nature. It could be engineering or just purely, it doesn't even need to have a physical form. It could be a culture which is pertaining to a particular community, which is important to that region or nation. So this is the most important idea that we are talking about when we talk about a cultural significance. Now, how do we understand if something is significant or no? First thing is whatever we are talking about, is it associated with a particular event or activities, or is it pattern? Does it follow a pattern? Does it happen at a particular time every single year? Or does it happen during particular seasons across the world at the same time, and things like that. One simple example for this would be, how do we celebrate Dashera? Something like that. Something as simple as that also could qualify as heritage. Next important category is if it is associated with important people or representative of the work of a master. A classic example for this would be, how Shakespeare's house has been converted into a very important heritage site, or we talk about Palladian villas. Now, these villas are important because they are associated with Andrea Palladio. Okay, otherwise, probably they would not have qualified as heritage. Next is, does it have any, Balaji, can we move on to the next point? Yeah. Next is, does it have any distinctive physical characteristics of architectural style or design, etc.? Now, I'm assuming a lot of you who have logged in for this session probably are architects or are interested in architecture. So you must have, you have seen things like the Pantheon in Rome. We are also aware of the Gol Gumbaz in Bijapur and Karnataka. So there is a particular architectural technology which has been used there. So if it is very unique, like, method or system of intersecting arches, or we are talking about Gothic arches or something like that, just purely because of that architectural attribute also, something can qualify as heritage. Next is sometimes certain sites qualify as heritage because they have a potential to yield important information. All of our Indus Valley civilizations would probably fall into this category. Because we know that after the partition of India and Pakistan, a lot of our heritage sites actually went to what is Pakistan today. So India then certainly felt a need to, trace back its history or history of the land, which was now in our hands. So then newer sites like Lothal and Rakhigadi and Dholavira were, were excavated, basically to be able to get information about the historicity of this country also. Next is technology or innovation. So what happens here is, when we build something really big or something which has never been done before, a bridge which is the longest, which spans across two water bodies or something like that, these would all, because of the sheer technological advancement, these would also qualify as heritage. Next point is very straightforward. It could be town planning. It could be how a town or a city has been planned. If there is an important street, there are avenues. Mysore itself has a lot of circles. So all of this also qualifies as heritage. Next point, which helps us in identifying if something qualifies as heritage or no, is integrity. Now, what we mean by integrity is a particular building or a particular practice might have been very important during a particular period of time. Now, over the years, some attributes of that would have changed, but everything should not have. So it means, what we are trying to say is, does it still resemble or does it still resonate with what was originally there, right? So of course, change is inevitable, but for example, if it was built in 15th century and if it was important in 15th century, whatever made it important is some of it still existing, then it would qualify as an integral quality for it to qualify as heritage. So property, it retains its historic appearance, also still has, I'm talking about physical heritage here. So does it still have some of the original materials? I will come to that later, but mostly this all helps in identifying if something has integrity or no, and can it qualify as heritage or no. Next, that we usually, the last point that we need to look at is what is the context. Does it still remain true to its original context? The people that it was associated with, are these people still there? Is it still very important to the community that it is set in? Then, so yeah, these three basic larger points would help you in identifying if something is heritage or no. Now, heritage is also broadly categorized into two types. One is natural heritage and the other is cultural heritage. So the example of natural heritage would be any of your natural sites. In this slide, we're talking about the Kaziranga National Park. Cultural heritage essentially involves human intervention. As in man, it should be something man-made. It should be something which has interpretation or involves human involvement, where they have changed certain features of the landscape around them, where they have built something. So there needs to be a material contribution very importantly. That is the important thing that we need to focus on when we are talking about cultural heritage. Whereas natural heritage could be something which is just naturally occurring. Broadly touching upon what is natural heritage, it could be anything, like I told you, which exists in nature. It should be very important. It should be a very important physical or biological formation. For example, if this ecosystem is disturbed, then it would have a larger butterfly effect, something else would get disturbed somewhere else. So we need to understand things like that. Is it a very important geological or a physiographical formation? Like, the example like the Grand Canyon, it is thousands of years old. And if we don't preserve sites like this, then we are essentially erasing an entire layer of human evolutionary history. And in India, the closest example to that would be Western Ghats. We hear about how sensitive that entire zone is. What is the need for us to protect it? So yeah, these are sites and things which actually exist in nature. Man has nothing to do with it, but man essentially needs to strive to at least preserve them to where they are today. So that is where natural heritage comes into picture. Sometimes it is qualified purely based on how beautiful the site is also. If it has a great value of beauty or aesthetic, then automatically that also qualifies as natural heritage. You can move to the next slide, Balaji. Yeah. Whereas cultural heritage, like I told you, is the most important thing is there should be human intervention when we are talking about cultural heritage. I'm not going to go into the details of the definition and all that. All of that are there on your screen. What we have done in each slide is we have tried to include some very interesting examples. One is of the Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan. Close home, Hampi is a classic example of cultural heritage. Man understands the sensitivity of the land and builds an entire civilization, sets his capital there in Hampi. So of course that also qualifies as heritage. Warsaw in Poland again is a very interesting example, because after World War II, everything was destroyed. So none of the original material remains, none of the original architecture remains, but people have recreated it to look like the original. And that is very important for the psyche of the people of Poland. So yeah, that also qualifies as heritage. And last is Moody-Ettu. This is a very interesting example because again, cultural heritage can again be bifurcated into two types. One is tangible, one is intangible. Tangible heritage is something which has a physical form. I can touch it, I can feel it, I can see it. It has a physical attribute to it. Intangible heritage is something which doesn't necessarily have a physical attribute. It could be an art form, it could be a technique of storytelling, it could be a music tradition, it could be anything. But it does not have a building, or it does not, sometimes doesn't even have a space dedicated to it. So all of that qualifies under intangible heritage, and anything which has something tangible for us to see and feel qualifies as tangible heritage. So yeah, I think I have covered whatever there is in this slide in the previous slide only. So yeah, again, not to dwell too deep, there are various types of tangible heritage. It could be just one building, it could be a site, It could be an entire area or traditional settlements. It could just be purely gardens, or the last category, which is slightly more complex, which Balaji sir will eventually take over to explain, is called as a cultural landscape. We will quickly run you through some of these examples. So what qualifies as historic buildings or sites is, classic example would be our Rashtrapati Bhavan, or group of monuments that are there in Pattatkal, which has more than 20 odd temples. Even religious centers, for example, we have shown Mecca here, which is in Saudi Arabia. So how much of the original historic layer of this site remains is questionable, but it is a very important religious site for the people of the Islamic community for almost 1500, 1600 years now. So automatically that also qualifies as heritage, because people have been undertaking pilgrimage to this site for quite some time now. Then there is vernacular and local heritage. These might be very humble buildings. These might be really small sites and places, but they are very important to the community that lives around them. So that also qualifies as heritage. It does not necessarily have to be very grand or big for it to qualify as heritage. Then archaeological remains, like I told you, all our Indus Valley sites would come in that. Then the last segment is ruin and remnants, where there was a big building existing before, but now only a small shadow of that building exists, but that also qualifies as heritage. Next is your historic and traditional settlements and areas. Again, we have noted down a few examples. Here what happens is it isn't just one building. It could be a group of buildings. It could be an entire area like a mohalla, or an entire chawl, or an entire group of streets. It could be an entire town or a city also in some cases, or a river bank like Vai here, or in Varanasi, and things like that. And you can move on to the next slide. Next is historic gardens. These are essentially man-made gardens. These are designed in the vicinity, usually of a building. Why are these important? Because without these gardens, you cannot necessarily imagine the setting that the building is in. That is what the first example makes a case for. It's a stunning palace, but without its gardens, and how beautifully manicured these gardens are, it makes no sense. The next example is of the classical gardens. These are again a very interesting share, because what happens here is, these are miniature versions of entire landscapes that are there in that country. So you go here and you experience the entire landscape, but in a miniature version where you can actually walk around and understand what the entire garden is. Then we have Mehtab Bagh. This is called as the Moonlit Garden. This is on the other side of the Yamuna River. You can actually see the Taj in the silhouette there. So this completes the entire composition. People usually fail to see this because this is on the other side of Yamuna. And then the last example is of the Kesar Kyari Bagh. This is in Jaipur. I think Balaji can take over from here and explain what cultural landscape.
Yeah, thank you, Shruti. Yeah, the reason we are introducing you to all sort of heritage, because there could be people in the crowd where they may not have an introduction to heritage itself. So we covered in a nutshell what is heritage and what kind of large classification it might encompass. And today's focus would be in our discussion would be intangible heritage, of course, and we would go on to make a case about intangible heritage. Before that, we thought it is very useful to introduce you to the idea of cultural landscapes, because cultural landscape is one such category which is officially defined by UNESCO as the combined work of nature and that of man. Which means that it's not going to be a pure landscape like Shruti had introduced you to natural heritage, where landscape itself, because of its bioheritage or geological heritage values, it becomes important. But on the other hand, we had cultural heritage, where man and man's intervention, his cultural products becomes important, intangible and tangible. But cultural landscape, in a nutshell, in a capsule, it gives you the entire combination of natural and cultural heritage together. But there is another category in UNESCO called mixed heritage, which we did not mention here. Mixed heritage is something where within a property, physical property, you have both natural heritage and cultural heritage, not necessarily interacting with each other. But cultural landscape is one such very special property where within an identified boundary, cultural aspects, attributes, we technically call it attributes, cultural attributes and physical components have a way of interacting with each other. There are many examples of such nature. We have Bamiyan Valley, Afghanistan, which Shruti had already introduced before. There's a very interesting example called Hongehani rice terraces in China, where parallel of such rice terraces we also find in India. Why this is important is because these stretches of rice terraces are around 4,000 years old, more than 4,000 perhaps, and they are very long stretches. We need to look at how they survive. These are man-made landscapes because rice terraces does not occur in nature. They are huge stretches of man-made landscapes. How do they survive? Because of the traditional knowledge people have, which are intangible heritage. And sometimes there are songs, sometimes there are poetry, sometimes there are mythology, which talks about techniques of agriculture, how to identify the clouds, how to till the ground, and what are the ways in which these seedlings can be passed on to next generation, how they can be stored. So human knowledge combined with artistic productivity and the landscape creation, they come hand in hand together. And then we have another example, which is Bhimbetka from India, Madhya Pradesh. Bhimbetka, we can be proud to say Bhimbetka is the only cultural landscape site officially inscribed in the UNESCO list. Not very proud to say it is the only one, but then at least we have one for now. That is the one of the cases we are making, that we don't have many. In Bhimbetka, you see around 40,000 years old human settlement, and then you find paintings, human creativity, which documents, the paintings documents the style of life people had at that point of time. We are talking about 40,000 years before. We're talking about the techniques of hunting they had, ritualistic practices they had, communication they might have had, pictorial communication, all that is documented in the intangible form, in their intangible creativity. So we are talking about such landscapes which has a combination of man-made heritage as well as the natural. Over to you, Shruti. Shruti can continue talking about intangible.
Yeah. So today's focus is mostly going to be on intangible heritage. Like I told you, this doesn't necessarily sometimes have tangible manifestations in terms of a physical form. What is interesting here is this is also again something which has to be inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants. Passed on from one generation to another to various descendants, which could be examples for that could be oral traditions, it could be a performing art, it could be a certain set of social practices, it could be just purely rituals, festive events, etc. But even in terms of our traditional craft skills or building skills, all of these are essentially intangible heritage. The importance of these is the fact that they are dying out very quickly. The most important thing is these are the ones which help us in maintaining cultural diversity in the face of growing globalization. We know now, we talk about the idea of a global village, things like that, but the idea is we are each unique, and this is one of the things which helps us in being unique as well. Plus, these intangible heritage or these examples of intangible heritage are not possible without groups of people who have a particular skill in this. So whenever we are talking about intangible heritage, it is extremely important to understand that there is a social and economic value which is attached within the transmission of this knowledge, and it is especially relevant to a particular minority group. When we talk about these in detail, I have a feeling you will understand it better. There are some examples from India which have already found their mention in the UNESCO World Heritage List. So yeah, UNESCO not only identifies cultural properties and cultural landscapes and all of that, it also identifies various intangible traditions across the world. India has also managed to get itself recognized. I think there are 10 or 12 Indian intangible heritage attributes which have been listed under UNESCO. And Mudiettu is one of them. This is in the southern states, and it is again a performance which involves musical traditions. There is a very what would you call it, exaggerated dance performances. It is associated with ritualistic beliefs also. Then there is Ram Leela. We will take up Ram Leela in detail later in one of our discussions. And then there is Chhau dance. This is mostly sort of restricted to West Bengal, and this dance is very interesting because apart from the music and the dance practice itself, you can see that they are wearing extremely exorbitant masks around them. So there is an entire community which is involved in making these masks. They understand what are the type of dyes that need to be used. Where do we find the materials to make these masks? Each of these masks have meanings. There are good masks, there are evil masks, and the victory of good over the evil. All of these various themes are there. So there is a particular community which has this knowledge, and that knowledge is intangible. That's the sort of case that we are trying to make here. You can move on, Balaji. I think I've covered this.
UNESCO, if we understand the structure of UNESCO's way of looking at intangible heritage, UNESCO has established a list of intangible cultural heritage. This never started as in the current form. The way we have it today, it didn't start like that. In 2001, there was a project. UNESCO started in the form of a project, not as a list, called Masterpieces of the Oral and Intangible Heritage of Humanity. Then by around 2003, there was a convention, international convention between the participant states parties. The convention was called Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. I think from that point onwards, UNESCO started working on a very formal list. Then we have, based on that convention, we have two lists which UNESCO compiles today, as we know it today, 2008 onwards, and then there were several revisions in 2010 and by 2013. Until today, we know of two important official lists. The first one is called Representative List of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity, which essentially tries to list those practices and expressions that demonstrate the diversity of the heritage and to create awareness. And this list, we must be aware that UNESCO is compiling, looking at the entire global population and global list. So this list is that list which comes filtered through several hundreds of the resources nominated. And then this is the filtered one, which seems to be representing the intangible heritage that is of global importance. So there are various ways of evaluating them. We are not getting into those details in today's, it's out of the scope for today's lecture. But you have to be aware that it is something which is of global awareness. It does not take into account each and every intangible practices in local areas, as we might be aware of in our surroundings. The second list which UNESCO came up with is called the List of Intangible Cultural Heritage in Need of Urgent Safeguarding. These are the elements. Officially, the intangible attributes are called elements in UNESCO's list. So these are the elements which needs an urgent safeguarding, which may be in the verge of threat. So there are these two lists we have to be aware of. Roughly, if I have to give you a number, around by 2018 list, we have around 508 elements identified under the first list, which is representative list, and we have which comes from around 122 countries. And we have around 35 elements from the urgent need, the list which lists the urgent safeguarding. So that is the rough number we are talking about. And we all know that 535 perhaps is not very representative of the number of countries and number of indigenous communities we have as a whole. But it's a good initiative that we have started to looking into it. Yes, Shruti, over to you.
So like I told you, India itself has managed to secure some spots. So Kudiyattam is, again, we will be taking it up detail in our informal session. It is a tradition of Sanskrit theatre, which is practiced in Kerala. Mudiyettu is also to that geographical area. A lot of us might not be aware, actually, the tradition of Vedic chants in India also has been identified as something which is important and needs to be documented as intangible heritage. Ram Leela, again, we will take it up in detail. It's a very interesting example. Ramman, Kalbelia is this particular folk dance from Rajasthan. Chao dance, I've already told you, it is mostly to do with West Bengal. Then there is a tradition of Buddhist chanting in Ladakh that also has been identified as, important cultural heritage. Then there is even things like cultural brass and copper making traditions from parts of Punjab and even certain parts of Bihar have been identified as intangible heritage. The most popular one right now is yoga. Yoga also, a lot of us might not be aware, but the tradition of yoga itself has been identified as heritage. And like I told you, there are certain practices or certain events which occur year after year, hence are very important to the community, and hence automatically qualify as heritage. One classic example of that is the Kumbh Mela that happens after particular intervals. I think every 6 years there is a mini one, and then every 12 years there is a major one, and we know millions of people come there. And how is the entire Kumbh Mela managed? How do you take care of lakhs of devotees which are thronging to these particular parts of India? How do you manage transport, their stay? How do you keep everybody safe? So these are all practices which have come forward by the understanding of the community. So all of this together also, in a way, qualifies as intangible heritage.
To add to that, I had mentioned earlier, there are 508 elements identified by the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity by UNESCO all over the world, involving all the country, 122 states parties, which are countries. Out of which the list which you are seeing on the screen right now is the total exhaustive list from India. This is not an example list. This is the entire list from India. So, which would have given you the idea of, already given you an idea of how much we are short of and how much more to go ahead. 12 cannot become a number which represents India's cultural heritage as such, because India is such diverse and vast. So we are talking about a very small list which is represented globally. We will stop the presentation for a short while before we re-enter, and we can have a bit of informal conversation. Myself and Shruti will have a bit of conversation, and then we'll get back to make a case of intangible heritage.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah. So how this part of the entire webinar is going to go is Balaji and myself are basically going to try to make a case for intangible heritage and the importance of intangible heritage. We are going to take you through some very interesting examples. We have very consciously chosen two major examples, or very lesser known examples across the world, which are not from India. And we have taken two examples from India so that you understand how important these intangible traditions are. Then we will briefly focus on the areas that I and Balaji sir have worked on. And eventually, Balaji will take over and speak about the challenges that are involved and what are the steps that need to be taken in our immediate context to do something about this. So the first example that we are going to talk about is this very interesting tradition which comes from Philippines, which is called as the Hudhud chants. Okay. Now this chanting tradition is mostly spoken of in the reference of this community called Ifugao. And there is actually a World Heritage Site also, just like the rice terraces of China, the Bala sir was explaining. The Philippine rice terraces are also a World Heritage property.
It is called Cordilleras.
Yeah, Cordilleras. So these rice terraces, the way people have been able to maintain and harvest in these rice terraces, there is a very interesting story behind it. So what happens is this chanting tradition is essentially very exhaustive. It is a knowledge system which exists with the community. So what the community has done is, over the past few hundred years, they have passed on the understanding that they have developed about rain, seasons of rain, what is the quantity of rain that falls during a particular season, how do I till the earth, how do I sow these seeds, at what time am I supposed to harvest these seeds, the angle at which I'm supposed to develop these rice terraces. All of this they have passed on from one generation to the other generation by a medium of songs. Okay, and UNESCO realized the importance of this, and they realized that without these songs and this community tradition, you cannot essentially even save the rice terraces effectively. And what happens is there are very few people who know about it, and these are all very old. So now they're trying to figure out ways in which they can still preserve this.
Of Hudhud tradition is at least 2000 years old, if I'm not wrong. So this metallurgy techniques they had, the kind of equipments they produce, containers and stacks, these are something which is very interesting. And one more point to add to that is that, if you have such an interesting intertwining intangible tradition with a physical site associated, if you do not have this tradition, you do not have that site. It is almost that kind of an interaction. But if you look at UNESCO's way of approaching it, we see one list, which is the Cordilleras is protected using cultural landscape framework. Cultural landscape is an official framework under UNESCO's World Heritage Convention. And then when you come on the other hand to the Hudhud tradition is protected under an entirely different framework, under an entirely different management body. it is protected under representative list of intangible cultural heritage. So it is, on the one hand, it is interesting, but on the other hand, it is sometimes worrisome that if we separate the intangible tradition from the physical property, and then because you must know that World Heritage Convention is a very strict property based convention. It guarantees to protect property boundaries, physical property boundaries, but does not guarantee to protect any, even though it is understood that intangibles are essential, there is no formal study of intangible related with spaces. There is no understanding of how intangibles are related to spaces. What are the mechanisms? For example, you may have social practices which are related to the land uses, and that social practices are guided using the norms which are intangible in the society. Now, this understanding is not clearly documented, which is little worrisome. I think you can take over to the next example.
Yeah, so that was one very interesting example. In fact, there might be parallels that we can find in the extremely rich rice growing states of India. In fact, I myself have heard of certain singing traditions that are there in India also, which cater to agricultural practices that people know. So what is interesting here is we need to understand these are not written in a book as a set of rules or anything like that. There is some scientific knowledge that the community has because they have lived in these regions for so long. They understand when the rains are going to come. They understand what is the right season to harvest. And they have found a very unique way to be able to preserve these practices. By not writing it in a book or making students sit in a class for 3 hours and teaching them how to do agriculture. These are just stories and songs that you grow up listening to, and then it's just a part of your entire knowledge.
When you said clouds and identification of rain clouds and all that, I have a very close tie Indian intangibles we have. Kalidasa's Meghdoot. We look at it as Kalidasa's Meghdoot. We look at it as a kind of epic poetry again. Very similar to what is Hudud. But then in that, if you look at it, very clearly documented. He documents several tens of varieties of clouds. How to identify them? If I don't remember the numbers correctly, maybe 24 to 30, somewhere in between that numbers, kinds of classifications of clouds. He says how, we only today we look at the sky and say, oh, black cloud, it may rain, it is just dense and all that. But then he identifies the shape of the clouds, colors of the cloud, what it will do to our environment. So that such knowledge are very valuable to us today.
In fact, in Kalidasa's poetry, what we can also see is he is even essentially talking about the direction of the movement of these clouds also. So he says, today it will come here, tomorrow it will go there, although it is very romantically woven into another sort of a story, but it is very interesting because he's actually telling you about the direction, what we talk about, southwest monsoons and this and that and all that. He is telling that. He's talking about the direction of the movement of rain and clouds, which hill is going to stop and then how is that cloud going to rain.
And so he describes it from an eagle's viewpoint.
Yes.
Like a cloud, and then if one sits on the cloud and looks below, the geography is occurs. Today we have satellite technology, but these traditions, the epic poetries, they're so interesting to see how someone would have gotten the idea of such vast geography, which is described in this kind of work. We get an idea of how far people were aware of these geographies. So the geographies and spaces and the intangible gets hand in hand tied together with that.
Yeah. So now I hope you guys are understanding the complexity that is involved with intangible heritage. Now, how do you physically, you can't physically document any of this. You can't just record somebody singing it and put it somewhere. People are never going to learn it. So it is very challenging. I would suggest it is far more challenging than preserving or conserving a physical, something which has a physical form. The next one is again very close to both our hearts. It is something called as the Kinu cultural landscape. This is very important, especially in today's world when we are talking about feminist principles and equality of female rights and all of that. So this is one such island which is off the Estonia's Baltic coast. It is a very small community. It is actually 2 islands. So there is one island called the Kinu Island and another one called the Manija Island. Each of these islands has a very small population of about 600 to 1,000 people. But this is under the UNESCO's World Heritage List. So what is interesting here is these are again matrilineal systems. I'll tell you why. Because the men of this community actually went into the sea. Even today they do. They go into the sea to hunt seals and fish and things like that. So for very long periods of time, these men are not there on the island. So the entire onus of preserving the agricultural practices of the island, the cultural practices, songs, dances, musical instruments, all of that has fallen on women for centuries now. So what has happened is these women have learned how to do agriculture. They have learned how to raise their kids, how to take care of their households, how to sort of, keep safe when the sea is rough. How do you keep people safe within the island? Various construction techniques also these women are aware of. They can even make and play several musical instruments. So it is very interesting how, because of the role of, very traditional role of hunter-gatherer, where man goes and gets and woman takes care of the household, an entire cultural system has come into picture, where today what has happened is these women are the custodians of this cultural practice. So to explain the most physical way how this comes out is they have this tradition of embroidery. So they have a particular loom in which they have to use to produce the thread. The wool is locally produced and locally manufactured. The entire machinery which is required to do this embroidery is also local, and they make these very beautiful, colorful embroideries. They make scarves for their head. Entire costumes are made out of this embroidery. And a very interesting tradition where the mother weaves her entire costume and gives it to the daughter for the wedding. So they just don't need to depend on anything which is outside the island. And the fact that the entire onus is on the female community makes this a very interesting case. Even these are not just random patterns. What is interesting is these are symbolic and rooted in ancient legends. So the colors they use, the patterns they use, they all have certain historic significance. Again, something which has been passed on from generation to generation cannot be just randomly taught like that in a classroom. It has to happen in a very informal environment. And there are, in fact, for all of you who are interested, there are several videos on YouTube which has documented this also. So again, a very interesting case where females have become custodians of an entire cultural tradition and practice. So
when you say
they are enlisted as the custodians now.
Yeah. Shruti, when you say females have become the custodians of their tradition and practices, and at some time even for the finances, economy of the place, it brings to my memory a lot of parallels from India.
Yes.
Cultures, where seafaring cultures, especially when men are outside for very long time, and then women are in a position where they have to take control of everything, and they establish a very coherent social community, which is very interesting, and it gives them that kind of a power and authority also. Lakshadweep is one very important example, where this happens, which is an island again, and then men are mostly seafarers, and women of the community have taken that kind of a position where they control the social and economic diversity of the place. And then I remember another example which is quite distinct but then very interesting is Chettinad community. Today we know Chettinad, we don't associate Chettinad today with any kind of seafaring activity because first of all it is not close to coast, close to sea coast at all. 100 to 200 kilometers away these places are, the 72 villages which were donated by the king to these, together is known as Chettinad Cultural Region. But the interesting thing why I brought this up is because Chettinad was originally not this location. Chettinad was a seafaring community, and this whole group of people were on the coast, hundreds of years back. And then when there is a sea calamity occurs, very similar to a tsunami, and then these people shift to the inlands, and then 72 villages were donated to them. And then what is interesting, why am I making this case, is because sometimes we associate intangible heritage with a particular place and a very small place, and then we hesitate to understand there could be dynamics in this. Now we are talking about one culture which was there on the sea coast. People have tuned themselves to kind of men going outside and women taking care of the household, and then the same culture is taken because of a calamity in the sea. It is taken hundreds of years before to the inland of the state, Tamil Nadu state today. And then there is no coast, but then the culture is coastal, very associated. You see Chettinad houses, because the men go to Belgium and Italy and all these places for trading. Chettinad houses are made out of elements coming from, column coming from Burma teak, wooden column, and then you will see Italian, Italian tiles, and then you will see chandeliers coming from Belgium. It is a kind of hybrid mix, and then their tradition, which is very much borrowed from the coastal culture, is now practiced in the inland area. Again, we see a very powerful women community there because men are still outside, so which is which sort of blurs the boundary of, are we talking about cultural heritage which originates, the intangible originates in an area and then it dies there? No, it's not true. We find these kind of transboundary, transnational at times. That brings to my memory again yet another culture called Geet Gawai,
Yeah.
which we think is such a minority group of language, only we find in such a small place in India. But Bhojpuri, we find Geet Gawai is a Bhojpuri tradition. It's a pre-marital, tradition, pre-wedding ceremony celebration with songs and dance and all that. But it is not from India. UNESCO has listed this as a representative cultural heritage list. But it is not from India. It is from Mauritius.
Yeah.
The Bhojpuri community from Mauritius have this tradition, and then from Mauritius but we are very familiar. If you look at the kind of practices, the language sounds very familiar to us from India. It's a transboundary intangible heritage. So we have an onus of looking at intangible, not being very regional, very national about it. Also with an open eye is a point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. In fact, when we talk about Chettinad houses, if I'm not wrong, even the spatial organization of Chettinad houses very evidently speaks about, how the female community is there physically more, and hence the spaces that are dedicated to the female community are far more evident,
Right.
as opposed to certain other cultures where females are sort of, all the female dominant spaces are kept to a certain portion of the house. So now moving on to our last two examples. This is something which is very Indian. These two are enlisted from India, very close to where we stay as well. So we spoke about this tradition called the Kuttiyatam. This is very interesting because it is a more than 2,000-year-old Sanskrit theatre tradition. It is the only Sanskrit theatre tradition that survives in the world. So definitely something which is, endangered, I would like to say, because there are very few people, very little patronage. Of course, there has been a revival in the 20th century. So here it has been identified under the representative list of intangible cultural heritage. It was inscribed in the year 2008. It is practiced in Kerala, and like I told you, one of the oldest living theatrical traditions anywhere across the world, not just in India. So it basically takes into the entire, this thing is performed in Sanskrit, which is a very rare occurrence in itself. It uses classical Sanskrit, not an evolved version of it. And it is also reflective of the local traditions of Kerala themselves. The most important aspect of this entire thing is the fact that it focuses a lot on Netra Abhinaya and Hasta Abhinaya. So Netra Abhinaya is where you try to tell the entire story and express your anguish and happiness and everything through just your eyes. And another one is Hasta Abhinaya, where you use a lot of your hands and hand gestures to explain the whole thing. So this is the kind of practice where the audience have to be able to see the eyes and the hand gestures of the person performing. It cannot be like we look at contemporary dance or, like we look at hip hop, where even from a distance you can understand what the performer is trying to say. This is very
almost like sign language.
It is sign language. Exactly.
Movement person is seated most of the times. And it's almost like a sign language with beautiful eye and hand expression.
There is a particular color palette which is usually a little understated so that the facial expressions come out in a certain way. Only particular colors are used to do the eye makeup and all of this. What happens is these are also performed in these theaters called, I think Kuppalams, is it, Balaji?
Yeah.
Kuttambalam. Yeah. So these are theaters which are erected, or the space for that is allocated very close to Hindu temples. Originally this was again very sacred and the entire knowledge system was with a very particular group of the community. Now they have opened it up a little. Here what happens is the performer eventually actually hands down written notes and traditions to his to people who come after him. And this is a very rigorous practice tradition. For somebody to become a stage performer and perform the art and have mastery over it, it takes a good 10 to 15 years. It's not something which comes easy. It is a very hard form. because it involves, very, very intense movement of facial muscles and certain parts of your body, which is actually very taxing. You tend to hurt your knees and your elbows and things like that. So you need immense practice to be able to do it on stage. And in fact, there is very interesting notes where they talk about Kutiyattam, where the artists actually even practice breathing technique, because they have to produce certain sounds and say certain things in a certain pitch, which actually strains their vocal cords. So they actually train their voices also to be able to practice this art form. Sometimes the entire performance can go up to 40 days, so audience is repetitive. Every day the audience is coming back, because your entire storyline spans for 40 days. So very intense, very hard on the performers, and something which is sadly losing patronage as we speak.
Yeah, the thing which interests me in this tradition, Kudiyattam, is first of all, it is a only surviving Sanskrit theatre, but it is also associated so strongly with temple services. Being architects and heritage conservators of architectural heritage, it is so important for us to understand. We have seen Kutambalam, but along with this Sanskrit theatre, Kutambalam gains a new meaning. And it is one of the most sacred temple services tradition amongst other traditions. Of course, we have Tevaram, Prabandham singing in South Indian temples, which were one of the oldest traditions, which are in native language, vernacular language. That is where you must notice the difference. Prabandham singing and Tevaram singing is in local Tamil language, while Kudiyattam is in Sanskrit language. There is a very different way of pronunciation training, as you said, for Sanskrit compared to the Prabandham singing and Tevaram singing. So they have, when you look at this even deeper, you will find institutions for them, separate institutions, where Odwars is another community, one community which does the Tevaram singing, and we have several Odwars, the schools where Odwars are trained in a particular manner, but on the other hand, we have some specific style of Prabandham singing associated with particular temples only, like Arayar Sevai, for example. Arayar Sevai is one of the Vaishnavite Prabandham cult, where Arayars are one very small community. Temples all over India, we still have that service, still alive. And if you take the Kaveri Basin, which is my area of study for my research, there is only one temple, that is Srirangam, where Arayar Sevai is practiced, with hand and eye expressions, which is not related to Kudiyattam, but it is a parallel culture. But in Melkote is another place where Arayar Sevai is practiced without the hand expression. So these are the only two places. Now my case here is, if you remove the temple from the place, it is so much strongly associated with these temples that if you remove this temple, the intangible does not survive. It dies there because it is associated with the precinct of the temple. There is a way in which they have to be seated. They have to perform a particular kind it there. It is so rigid that they cannot perform it anywhere on the street. So there are these restrictions for certain intangible traditions, where if the space goes, the tradition also goes along with it. So we need to understand this. The other point I wanted to architecture versus intangible association is that how interesting inscriptions we find in temples, which documents the intangible tradition. For example, Kudiyattam, the example which we are discussing here, itself is part of a larger umbrella of Kuthu. Chakyar Kuthu, Nanjiyar Kuthu, and all these kind of Kuthu. Kuthu is one genre of performance, and Kudiyattam belongs to one of them. And we find a lot of inscriptions in Tamil Nadu, especially in Tanjore, Thirupidai Marudur, Vedaranyam, Tiruvarur, and then Omampuliyur. These are very valuable inscriptions for us, which are on the temples. Temples behave as a place where things are documented in concrete nature. People treated temples not only as a usable space, but they also treated it as a document. If you look at old temples, you will find all the inscriptions which describes these intangible practices. In fact, Tanjore is a very interesting example. Brihadishwara temple, I'm sure everybody is familiar who are here, who knows about architecture. Temple documents, there is a very big panel on one of the walls of Brihadishwara temple talking about temple dances and temple musicians. It becomes a temple at that point of time, becomes an official document. And then it says it documents around at any given point of time, around 400 to 500 dancers were patronized. They were given houses, they were given land donations, and their salaries were also documented in these temples. So it is so interesting for us to look at these relationships between how spaces behave as play a certain role with associated with these intangible traditions. Okay, Shruti, I think for a short, we have a little bit of shortage of time. So the last thing to touch upon, and then we can move on to
the
our
last example, I
presentation
think we
back.
can briefly touch on it. It is the Ramlila tradition in India. So Ramlila basically focuses on, this entire way how you depict Ramayan in forms of a theatrical performance. So what happens is there is, it is especially performed during Dashahara, and so what we are trying to say is that people here focus on telling you the tale of Ram, the Rama, the Ravan. There is a very interesting climax where the entire effigy is burned. Effigy of Ravan is burnt. What we are trying to focus in terms of intangible here is that it's not just the practice of Ramayana or the fact that of Ramlila, or the fact that Ramayana as a tale is being told. What is very important is that there is so much else which comes associated with it. There is an entire community which is specialized in making the costumes for these people. There is an entire community which specializes in making the headgears and all the various weapons, as in weapons which they imagine would have been used during that time, assuming it's a reality. So all of these weapons, there is a particular skill set that is involved in all of this. And understanding Ramlila without any of this is not possible, because even if any one of these communities does not exist tomorrow, Ramlila performance is not going to be complete. Nowadays Ramlila has become so theatrical. When Hanuman flies, they have created, with use of modern technology, they've created a way in which the person who's playing Hanuman is actually harnessed and then he's made to look like he's flying. So there is a lot of interesting things that are happening where our traditions are very old, but then we are adapting it to today's technology, and we are trying to make it very interesting to keep the today's audience interested. So these performances usually go on for 10 days, 7 days. Some of them, especially in Banaras and Ayodhya and all these places, are very famous. You have such heavy international crowd as well. So it is very interesting to see. So what the point that we are trying to establish through all of this is that it is a very delicate ecosystem, if I may say so. A very delicate ecosystem where even if one element is picked out of this recipe, the entire dish is not going to be ready. It is going to be very difficult if somebody who's making masks is not encouraged anymore. Then chow dance is not going to happen. Somebody who makes headgears is not encouraged, and that family stops producing headgears, then Ramlila would not be a possibility. A particular family which specializes in costumes and knows how to drape it, because there are various draping techniques. We know that in India itself, there are like probably hundreds of ways of draping a sari. So the thing is, if that draping technique is lost, then the authenticity that comes with that draping technique to this performance is also going to be lost. So we need to network of various practices which come together to make this one intangible cultural heritage possible. So when we're talking about preserving intangible, so many communities which are associated with the associated with one particular tradition, and even the loss of one small step in that entire ladder is going to eventually collapse the entire system. I think that's about it, Balaji. You can take over.
Okay, I think we can move on back to presentation. I have a little. I hope everybody can see the presentation. Can you see, Shruti?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay. So we now I want to highlight the status of heritage protection in India very quickly for everybody's information. So far, we had seen what is the range of heritage we have and where intangible heritage stands. But this is a summary, quick summary of what is the official status of it. Now, I have prepared a quick graph of official status of heritage protection in India. If you look at the graph on the top, all that which has a prefix of ICH are intangible cultural heritage. ICH. There are 4 important bodies we need to look at to look at the official culture from India. These are important bodies from India to represent in ICH, intangible cultural heritage. We have somewhere around 38 elements identified by Sangeet Natak Academy. We have around 30 elements identified by IGNCA. We have around 106 elements identified from the national list for intangible cultural heritage. By the way, these are available online. Everybody can check it. Where state-wise list is provided in the national list. State-wise, but it is still, according to us, is underrepresented, because from Tamil Nadu you will see some 4 or 5. From Andhra Pradesh again yet another 4 or 5, which is sort of really underrepresented compared to, because talking about my own research, I have studied Kaveri River Basin, which the area covers around 80,000 square kilometer. From this area, only musical traditions, if I talk about, I was able to document at least 18 different forms of musical traditions alone. And then talk about other forms of performances, theaters and paintings and metal crafts. There are innumerable. And when we talk about all the states in India, I think 106 is quite underrepresented, though the effort is appreciated, because of course, when it comes to government, there are other kind of hindrance and other kind of ethical considerations, and so many obstacles which prevents people from listing the entire list. So then you have representative list, which we are talking about, UNESCO, which identifies and inscribes 13 only from India, 13 elements. And there is one cultural landscape which World Heritage protects, which is Bhimbetka. Another cultural landscape from Government of Assam, MCLR Act protects, which is Majuli. And then World Heritage, then we come to physical heritage sites, not intangible. World Heritage site, mixed category, we have only one. Natural, we have 7. Cultural heritage 34, geological 34 from India. I'm talking about India only. Then we have ASI protected monuments that are of national importance, 3,684. We are talking about monuments that are protected as of national importance from entire country, very close to only 4,000. And then yet another 4,000 from state protected monuments, which is again sort of compared to the entire list, maybe underrepresented. But we can't blame anybody. As a public, this is the whole reason why we are showing you today, both myself and Shruti are trying to highlight the fact that public has to build a database. It's not enough to only depend upon government database. We need to also start building a database. Also, when we talk about intangible heritage, UNESCO lists, there are ICH we have already spoken about. Creative Cities Network is another list, where in Creative Cities Network, Chennai and Varanasi comes under music cities. Similarly, we have Hyderabad in cuisine city, the city which is of interest for cuisine. We have Bombay for film cities. And then we have one more. So from India, we have only 5 of them which are identified, but this is not this particular Creative Cities Network does not talk about the physical the association between these activities and the physical space. They are more into economies of these craftsmen and artists and how to sustain and what kind of new programs can be built over on top of it, which is essential, but we also should look at the physical list of these. Then we have Ministry of Culture, of course, Sangeet Natak Academy, which is also working on a pan-Indian ICH inventory, which is a work in progress. INTAC claims to have a list of intangible cultural heritage, but on their website there is no list published. At least on their website there is no list available. ICH and physical properties is one of the issues which we constantly talk about. They are treated as independent units in most of the list. Physical properties are separately treated, ICH are separately treated. This is one of the reasons why we are talking about an initiative from our side. Then the last concern, which is always very, very bothering from intangible cultural heritage perspective, is intangible cultural heritage, very distinct from physical heritage, has a lot of ethical issues, because we are talking about people here. We are talking about living heritage here. We are concerned about people's cultural tradition and practices. Without consent of people, we can't even click a photograph and publish it. But in this case, we are talking about a whole cultural tradition. Isn't it better that rather than people taking control and documenting all intangible heritage of tribes and communities, isn't it better when people from the community, for people who are close to community, who can engage with the community, can come up with a database and a list? So that is one of the arguments which we are trying to make. So that brings us to an initiative, which is an independent research initiative by myself and Shruti. We have initiated a program called Open Curated Cultural Database to build a database which is quite distinct from all these other official databases. So we are trying to build a database which is of public interest, built by public and openly available to public. So public cultural heritage database, with some special attention to ICH, not only ICH, but also physical heritage, which are intertwined with ICH. We are also talking about curating them and classifying these database. It will be open and freely accessible. So we are talking about a method of collecting data, which is called crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is an idea where public as a stakeholder involves themselves. It is so easy. If I belong to a community, and then if there is an intangible heritage which I can freely document from my community, I have all the rights to document it. Getting consent becomes easy because legal issues otherwise crop up later. Then I can, with the consent, I can upload the database. We are talking about also inviting volunteers who can contribute both in terms of data and as well as skills. We need volunteers who can contribute in terms of any sort of data, which we will detail out in a moment, and any sort of skills. If they can make a map out of it, they can do statistics. We are talking about all sort of volunteers who can help build the database, which is out for public. No hassle of copyright and license concerns for educators and researchers, which currently is a problem from other databases. Work to be initiated in 2 phases. We are planning it in 2 phases. First one would be volunteer based. We invite volunteers and we'll initiate, and within the closed environments, what we develop as a platform will be put out for public. Of course, it will not be closed to public. It will be put out to public. In second phase, it will be open to everybody equally. Data can include anywhere from images, labeled locations, which you capture simply on your cell phones, a place or a location which people may not know, but you have captured it on your location. You can label it, and with a short description, you can share it. Classwork. In architecture colleges and planning institutions, we are known for generating huge amount of database, in terms of classwork and studio work, documentation, village studies, and all that. But most of the cases, what happens, they are not licensed. Their copyrights are not properly understood. Nobody uses. Very few of these classworks goes into publication, but in most of the cases, they are just stored in some repository physically somewhere in a room, and then over the time it is destroyed and it is not searchable in a digital database. So what we are talking about is clearing out the licenses to these kind of classworks. Also put it in the database. Your data can be short videos. It could be write-up. It could be a metadata for an existing list. Local songs, stories, even recipes, historic recipes. People as a resource. Earlier when we were talking about Chakyar Kuttu and Nanjyar Kuttu and Kudiyatam, we also should remember parallelly many of these contributors to these fields, like Madhavan Achar. And these are the people who have contributed, but we don't remember them. We remember the Kudiyatam. We don't have an official list of people who are resourceful to us. So here we are talking about also listing the people who are resourceful. Here we also remember official initiative of Japanese government, where Japan initiated an official national register where they also register people as a resource people. And in fact, they call people as national monument, which is interesting. We can a non-official public usable database of people. Volunteers are certainly welcome. This is the email ID which we have created, where you can drop us a mail saying that you are interested, then we will get in touch.
I think Balaji's network probably has an issue. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Can I talk, Balaji? Are you done?
Yeah.
So I think what we have tried to do is basically take you through understanding what is heritage, and what are the various things which qualify under heritage, what is the wide gambit that we are actually talking about. And I would like to add a small point to what Balaji was saying. He was talking about people as heritage. Please read up on this, those of you who are interested. Like he mentioned, Japan does it. In fact, sometimes we ourselves are so ignorant of the potential that our surroundings have. I personally hail from this town called Dharwad in North Karnataka. And I was trying to apply for this particular fellowship where I was trying to understand the poets and writers of North Karnataka. That is when I realized that there are more than 5 Jnanapita awardees from that one particular town, which we are not even aware of. So even talking about people becomes very important. It could be done in terms of photographs. It could be done in terms of the books that they've published. It could also be done in terms of interviews in case some of these people are still around. We are trying to do something on those lines. Something which is an independent research, which both Balaji and I have thought that we could culminate this webinar into. And those of you who are interested to volunteer, the moment you send us an email, we will get in touch with you. And yeah, so that's about it. It is, I hope, or we hope rather, that this session was useful. I think now we can open it to question and answers, Balaji, if somebody has.
So before the question and answers, we would like to acknowledge both myself and Shruti, Mysore School of Architecture, for giving us this wonderful opportunity. Our principal, Professor Sapna Shukmar, for giving us this opportunity. MSA Mysuru Social, especially the webinar team who has been coordinating with us and nicely put out this platform.
That is Professor Mahant and Sandeep Kasina. So they have been helping us out with the entire session.
And Professor Safia MD for her valuable input. Some of the contents in the presentation also come from her inputs.
Yeah. In fact, the example that Balaji sir was talking about the matrilineal system of islands in Lakshadweep, which is the Minicoy, a lot of the study for that was done by Safia herself, and then that's how we know about that particular cultural setting. Yeah.
Thank you. We are open for questions.
Open for questions.
May I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
Tejashri. Yes.
Hi, Balaji, and hi, Shruti.
Hi.
It's a pleasure.
Hi.
to
Hi.
both. So it was a wonderful presentation and really a great source of knowledge. I would love to be a part of the open source that you have described here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You're most welcome.
Yeah.
I have two, three questions. Is there any limitation for participants to ask?
No,
one or two,
I think you can. Yeah, you can ask.
Okay, great, Shruti. Thank you. So there was an example mentioned in the presentation about the recreated site of Warsaw,
Yeah,
Poland.
yeah.
How does the recreated site evoke the essence of integrity? And if it does, then what happens to the criteria of it to be considered old as well or historical as well in order to go into the heritage category?
Yeah. This, like we all know, is a very interesting example. What Tejashri is trying to ask everybody or sort of tell everybody is that Warsaw in Poland was a very important site during the World War II. And during the entire debacle of World War, what happened was a majority of the city was completely brought down to grounds. And a lot of the physical remains of the site, especially the main palace square and all of that, were completely lost. Then what happened is the mayor of the city, the community, all of them decided that what we have destroyed is very important to the memory and the identity of people of Poland. So what happened as a result of that was there was there was a crowdsourcing. People, because there was absolutely no record, nobody had actually documented what these places look like and everything. So what the municipality did was it called out for volunteers and it said, can you please come and share your family photographs? So this was one very small initiative which was taken. So people came with their family photographs, something that they would have clicked and the background of that place would have come in the picture. So they used these photographs and recreated something which looked exactly like the Warsaw that Poland had lost as an aftermath of World War II. Now, when we're talking about integrity and authenticity, there are certain examples which go beyond the norm of, is it that old? Does it have original material? And this is one very unique case. It happens because it is so important to the memory of the people. They still identify with it as a very important site, something that has been passed on to them from generations. So it does qualify under all these categories. Although the original material is lost, the original building is also lost, but the memory and the association of people with that place is still original. Hence, that is one of the reasons I think even under which the debate was carried out, and Poland was able to convince the UNESCO body that yes, this will qualify. Even though it is not the original, it can still qualify because of the associations and memories people have. More importantly, it was something which was seen as a nation building exercise, because Poland after World War had lost so much, in terms of community, people, resources, everything. So this was in a way which also helped in uplifting the spirits of an entire nation and brought about a sense of nationalism as well. So all of these go beyond the material aspects of integrity and what the building is and what survives today and goes on to still qualify as a World Heritage Property.
Can I add to that, Shruti?
Yes,
I think
Balaji.
when we talk about authenticity and integrity, I think one most important document, a charter which we must refer to from UNESCO is NARA document of
NARA
authenticity,
document.
which also talks about these intricacies, nuances which we have. Not every time freezing of the original material gives us authenticity, but sometimes we have to see what brings value to that heritage. Looking at the value, we need to look at it, because most of the chariots, if we look at Indian tradition of temple chariots, they are made out of wood, and we always inevitably every year we bring down the entire chariot and reconstruct it. In most cases of the chariots, not everywhere, but most cases of temple chariots, we bring them down and then with new material we reconstruct. Doesn't mean it has lost its authenticity. So I think NARA document can clarify this beyond.
We will mention that in the comment section as well for those of you
Yeah.
who want to look it up.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Bala and Shruti both. My
Thank you
next
for the
question is, how are intangible heritage linked or important for conserving tangible heritage? And if they are, can you cite an example from the list or from the four descriptions that you mentioned during the dialogue part? And how are architects responsible to conserve this kind of heritage when they are professionally trained primarily to look at the built heritage ones?
I think I will start and Balaji can take over because he did roughly touch on it a little. In fact, one of the things that I did my master's research on comes to my mind here. This is a small little village called Lakkundi in North Karnataka. Here, the intangible aspect of the whole thing is the community itself has a particular knowledge in the way they build, because there are no architects there are no builders there. The community gets together and builds their homes. They have a very interesting understanding in the way in which they actually identify their neighborhood boundaries also. So the community is involved even at a planning stage. So like today we call, area or ward or whatever, they have something called as an ONI. And this understanding is purely intangible because it is there in the memory of the people, and they are able to tell you exactly what is an ONI and what is a space and things like that. And very interesting is they have a very interesting way of measuring system. They do not use meters and feet. What they tend to use is the system of ankanas, and they know that very well. So the entire house is measured in terms of these modules. So yeah, there is a physical representation of this in terms of a building, but the knowledge behind that is intangible, because it is not recorded, it is not there written anywhere or anything like that. And what makes it even more interesting is they use cow as a measure for this. Cow mane, the oxes that are used there to till the earth in agriculture. So they use them as a measure to come up with this column to column spacing. So all of this is something, a knowledge system which exists with the community, which I came across and sort of tried to bring out in my research only after interacting with the community. So this is a very intangible thing which has a physical manifestation. So now when an architect or a conservation architect has to do some sort of an interpretation in that town, it is very important to understand this knowledge system that the community has. And we need to also make a very strong attempt to sort of sync with the systems that are already there. I'm not talking about copying, I'm not talking about purely getting inspired either, but something which complements the system which is already there. I think that is where the role of the architects and conservation architects in particular comes in, because there is a very strong knowledge system that is there. And when I am intervening in that context, I have to be very aware of that knowledge system, and only then can I make a contribution which is I would consider worthy. Yeah.
I studied music and related spaces. I can give you one example from that. When people are very conscious about the, though if you don't know about the acoustics of the space, what kind of music, the music which is specific to the community, sounds good and effective and communicative in what kind of space. This is where this awareness is quite well seen in all communities. An African tribal music which has a very high pitch, it's always sung in an open ground, in a forest area or in an open ground. You will not sing it in a chapel where reverberation is very high, echo is very high. This understanding, but church music and organ music is played within the church premises where the kind of volumes give you that kind of a reverberation. I mean, to give you a very simple example, this understanding between what space can do to your performance is also prevalent and very well known. But we need to take up a scientific study of how people understand it and how it is documented in their communities.
I think Tejashree is sort of asking us to describe with respect to one of the 4 examples. I think the most important one is the Kutiyattam that we were talking about, because this is a Sanskrit theatre performing tradition. They actually erect, or there are theatres which are already there. So there is a spatial attribute to this. And these are always associated with temples or Hindu temples or Hindu temple complexes. So right beside them is where this entire theatre is. And these are called as Kuttapalams. The exact word for that is Kuttapalams. So there is a particular measurement which works for these theatres, like I told you, because the audience is supposed to be able to look at the eyes and the the gestures that are made through hand. So it cannot be performed in one of our theaters where 1,000 or 2,000 people sit and watch something. So this is something where the audience size is restricted. Only so many number of audiences or somebody who's sitting at the farthest row can actually see the expressions. So there is a very strong architectural element to this. Although the entire system qualifies under intangible, but there is a very tangible aspect in terms of a spatial design which can enhance or which can complement this performance, because we are talking about a particular size. Even when we talk about open air theaters, or even when we talk about movie theaters, we talk about the visual angle, we talk about the visual distance. So all of that becomes very important in this, because I as a viewer should be able to see the expressions of the eyes and the various mudras the performer is actually making on the stage. So there is a particular understanding in the way the space has to be. And this is where architects and conservators have to step in and say, no, the audience size cannot be bigger than this, in which case we will have to use a digital screen, and a lot of the fun is lost when we tend to digitize these live performances. So yeah, I think Kutiyattam is a very classic example where architecture plays a very important role, and it could be lost. I mean, it is sort of codependency. Without the space, the form is not there. Without the art form, the space is not there. So that
I remember one of our friends, Devakumar, has conducted a research on a tradition called Kalam Elthu Pattu. So which involves Kalam Elthu Pattu. The name itself signifies in Malayalam. Kalam Elthu is a drawing practice, and then Pattu is singing. So there is the drawing is drawn parallelly when songs are rendered, and it is drawn in a particular mantapa created for this purpose, which is a definite volume. And then your drawing has to be of certain proportions and certain manner. If Devkumar was here, he would have clarified it much better, but we'll find another occasion to do it. But it is such an interesting exercise where drawing and singing and the making of the creating of temporary architecture comes together. Once the entire singing is done for that ritual, once it is done, the drawing is erased and the mantapa is demolished. Now it is such an integrated practice where space and drawing and singing comes together. We can see these kind of examples are very prevalent. Bhumika is asking from the chat box, do we have certain criteria, as in these many people should be involved for it to be considered a national intangible cultural heritage? She's asking whether there is any criteria. Shruti?
Yeah, as in whenever you're talking about criteria, sometimes when we are talking about it being important to the entire global community, because World Heritage has to be something which is important to the entire global community. Only then it qualifies as World Heritage. But like Balaji sir and I were trying to tell everybody that there are various categories of heritage, right? So for example, my own house, which is owned by my grandparents, which is 200 years old, it is heritage to me, but it might not be of national importance, or it might not be of regional importance, but it is. So family heritage, personal heritage, there are these categories also. So heritage is not always identified or can be quantified based on scale. It cannot be quantified based on how many people were involved or how many people associate with it. But yeah, for something to be of national or international importance, yeah, the scale is sort of important. But for it to essentially qualify as heritage, the scale is not important.
Tejashree is again asking, last question, she says, what if the community itself is not interested in continuing with the tradition in spite of knowing the significance and relevance?
Yeah.
How do we preserve intangibles in that scenario wherein community is a heritage custodian but backs out for protection. Similar example I have come across in my practice in Kalyan, a suburb of Mumbai.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the very worrying and important concern we need to address, because in terms of other physical heritage, archaeological heritage for that matter, is just lying there. Only educated communities are engaging with that heritage and they do whatever it is good for that. But in terms of intangible heritage, it is always community is the most important thing to consider. People are most important because it is living heritage. It is very common to find that community is not interested. I think until they find scope in it, until they find importance in it. So I think it's a constant to and fro work between the communities which have the heritage, their awareness, and professionals like us. I think it is the large network which has to be built. That is why I think it is also important to build a huge network, massive, so that people can communicate easily. It shouldn't take time that you have to file a petition and it takes 1 year, and then people then are approached separately by another body and they are talking to a body independent of each other. This is what is not preferred there. In this kind of occasion, conversation should be wide, awareness should be large number of people should know, large number of people should talk. If I am an educated person from my community, and if I know my community has a certain practice, I can take an initiative, irrespective of being whether you are a heritage conservation professional or not. I think heritage conservation that way becomes everybody's business. It becomes important for everybody. So it is the long time conversation, long time awareness which will play a role, I guess.
In fact, I think one of the biggest debates that happens in any of our conservation studios is, can you force people to do it? Of course, we can't.
Of course, we can't.
We can only make them aware. We can try to, make them understand the importance of it, how unique it is. Try to find some form of financial and social viability for it. But beyond that, the custodians have to take initiative. And
it's a public initiative. And on this regard, I'll give you an interesting thing to go and look up on websites of Sangeet Natak Academy and IGNCA and even the Ministry of Culture. When you find this list, in the list there are tabulation of what is the tradition, what are the details, but there is one column which says consent. So consent becomes very, very important for intangible tradition. So their consent letters are available to you. How, people have spoken, continuously communicated, continuously worked towards getting the consent and taking people of the community as stakeholders. Participatory approach is the only approach which can work for intangible heritage, I believe. Consent becomes very important for ethical concerns. Thank you for that question. Even when we are trying to make the database, we'll make a framework where consent and ethics becomes not everybody can just put in all the information without consent and without ethical practice. Anything else?
Any more questions if there are, because we have exceeded the webinar time by a good half an hour.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have some thank you messages. I think there is a question.
Kriti,
Please read. Go ahead, Shruti.
So Kriti is asking a question that if the rangolis, the columns that we draw in front of our houses, is important. It's a very interesting example. In India, we are going to find everything at a stone throw away. There is rangolis, there is the way we cook, the way we sing, the way we write, talk, languages, dialects. India is something which has vast potential. This is a very good example actually, because it is practiced by a vast group of people. Each one of them in some cases it is passed on from generation to generation as well. How you draw it and the technique of putting those bottus and all of that is passed on. There is an entire community which depends on making these rangolis and colors for this rangoli. Even today, especially if you're in South India, you will hear somebody selling rangoli at least one day a week on the road. So very interesting example, Kriti. Probably it needs to be documented. But the extent, the challenge in something like this is rangoli, the tradition itself is something very peculiar and unique. And even the way people draw it, because the way I and my mother draw it is going to be very different from. So how do you document something like this? It can be documented in terms of technique. It can be documented as something which is very important and representative of a cultural value a particular community has. But we might not be able to document every pattern and every design. That is going
I want to add some points to this. This is a very significant question, I think, because like we have several other traditions which are not looked into. We don't see these as part of our elements which are listed as part of official lists. Why? Is because, official list has a way of going about it. It has a framework and it has certain level of significance. National government will not list an element unless it is proven to be nationally significant, to the whole country. UNESCO will not list it under their intangible heritage list unless it is proven and demonstrated to be globally important. So global significance and national significance are two, important criteria which comes there, and they have a whole list of framework and the way they document, the way the documentation has to be produced. But what we have to remember is that only those that are of global importance and national importance are not the only ones which are important to us as communities. There may be traditions like Rangoli, which may be globally important, nationally important, but not is documented in the framework, within the framework prescribed. Or sometimes some traditions are locally important, which are not, which are not identified at all in the global platforms or national platforms. So that is why even our database is very important, because we are trying to build a database which does not look into its global or national significance. It looks at the overall significance. It could be just any small traditional practice around your village, and within our communities. So we have to look at it beyond all these labels of global significance and national significance. I think we have to now start looking into all sort of.
Yeah, those are for government bodies and agencies and international bodies and agencies to identify as global. Is that just because a heritage is only limited to a particular small group of community doesn't make it any less important. We saw that example of the island where it's a matrilineal system. We are essentially talking about 600 people. That's all, but it is important. So we need to start looking at everything that can qualify as heritage as important. And as volunteers, at least we should look at documenting and trying to prepare a database for each one of these. And whether it is globally or nationally important or no, like Balaji sir says, is irrelevant, because what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand the gambit of heritage. There is so much possibility for something to qualify as heritage. And if it does, then we should definitely talk about it.
I think there is another question which Preetham has written. It says, with respect to music as an intangible cultural heritage, is there a specific time frame that certain forms of music need to fit into for them to be considered as cultural heritage by the organizations that were mentioned in the presentation? How long in history should the style of music be in practice? Would it still be considered as cultural heritage if it is only a few decades old instead of centuries old like ancient? No, there is no hard and fast regulation, but the importance and significance has to be proven. There is a list of criteria which will tell us the importance and significance. Not essentially, like our Archaeological Survey of India gives a deadline of sort of 100 years tag on archaeological monument to be qualified. There is no hard and fast rule like that. Like to give you an example, recently reggae music was identified as intangible cultural heritage. Reggae was identified as, the modern form of reggae was identified in its modern form itself, is identified as intangible cultural heritage, which is of global value. So I don't think there is any restriction as in number of years, but then one has to go through the documentation to really establish the significance of it. How it has been important for people, how it has been important for community, how it has played, what role it has played over the history. The way we make the case depends on how it gets qualified.
And continuity, I think continuity again is one very important factor. Something cannot be a heritage just because somebody practiced it for 2 years or 3 years. There has to be a continuous interest or continuous practice of a particular tradition, and it could easily qualify as but yeah, it has to qualify all those characteristics of significance, integrity, authenticity, the context in which that we're talking about. These pointers have to be taken up in detail and see how many of those does any particular music tradition adhere to, and then it could qualify. It could. Age is not, or the number of years it has been in practice is definitely not just the criteria.
Stakeholders' consent and stakeholders' interest plays a very big role in intangible heritage list. So before it goes to the list, it has to be clarified what kind of stakeholders' interest holds good here. It should not be vested interest, it should be for the public benefit, and stakeholders' consent is also very essential.
I think that's about it, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you all. Thank you for the participants.
Yeah.
For engaging with us actively.
Yeah.
basically.
And please watch out for the social media profiles of MSA on the Instagram and Facebook page. We are hoping that this is the first of many, and there will be many more such webinars held and taken an initiative from our college. And there might be other experts talking on other fields, but let us hope this is just a beginning and there is more to come. Yeah.
Thank you.